As tensions rise over the possibility of China making a move on Taiwan, Taipei isn't just sitting back. While the US has promised to back Taiwan's fight to stay independent, including military support, Taiwan knows it's got to stand on its own 2 feet. To keep China at bay, it's clear Taiwan needs to show some muscle. Usually, having nukes would do the trick, but given Taiwan's tricky spot on the world stage, getting into the nuclear game could really rile up Beijing, seeing it as Taiwan trying to cut ties completely. And Beijing would likely take that as a straight-up declaration of war. Though Taiwan runs its own show with its own government and economy, big players like the US still don't officially recognize it as its own country. So from China's point of view, any major move by Taiwan towards independence, especially getting nuclear weapons, would be like declaring war against the People's Republic of China. But Taiwan can't just keep putting up with China's threats forever. It looks like Taiwan's about ready to show Beijing it won't be pushed around anymore. So what's Taiwan's play if things heat up? Let's unpack their strategy and see just how they might swing back if the Red Dragon comes knocking. From unexpected military tactics to audacious defense plans, you won't believe the aces Taiwan has up its sleeve. Let's begin. Without nuclear weapons, Taiwan's military planners were forced to come up with an idea for a single, strategic attack that would, hypothetically, be too devastating for Beijing to ignore. A threat to the Chinese mainland so catastrophic that before China moved forward with any invasion scenario, it would have to be taken into serious consideration. It would be difficult to hit Beijing, even with Taiwan's newest set of supersonic ballistic missiles, and the capital's surface-to-air defenses are simply too strong for a conventional aerial bombardment to do the job. But what about the Three Gorges Dam? Were the Three Gorges Dam to be destroyed, the water contained in its 600-kilometer-long reservoir would cascade into the lower Yangtze River, quickly overwhelming the flood containment lakes located downstream, resulting in immeasurable destruction to the population and industrial centers of Wuhan, Nanjing, and Shanghai. In the resulting flooding, 2/3 of China's rice production would also be lost, a hit that would potentially be felt by some 400 million people. In the event of undeterrable Chinese aggression, Taiwan's unofficial plan to level the Three Gorges Dam would put the threat of mutually assured destruction on the table. What's really scary to think about here is that this gives Taiwan the opportunity to use conventional weapons to create devastation on par with or greater than a nuclear attack. If Taiwan did retaliate against Chinese aggression by taking out the dam, however, this would almost certainly prompt an actual nuclear response from Beijing, whose 500 or so operational nuclear warheads would be more than enough to sink the island into the Pacific. Located in Hubei, the Three Gorges Dam stands 181 meters high and is 2,335 meters long and creates a reservoir that covers 1,000 square kilometers and contains nearly 40 billion cubic meters of water. It's the world's largest hydropower project and supplies electricity to 20 million Chinese citizens, making it an attractive target since its construction began in 1932. In 1939, when Japanese military forces took control of China, believing they would maintain it indefinitely, they implemented their own designs for the prospective dam, calling it the Otani Plan. But after China was liberated by the US after World War II, an engineer from the United States Bureau of Reclamation named John L. Savage picked up the project. More than 50 Chinese engineers traveled to the US to receive advanced training, but due largely to civil unrest, the project never fully got off the ground. It wasn't until 1954, after a series of devastating floods that killed an estimated 33,000 people, that the dam project was revisited. But it would still take until 1992 before the National People's Congress finally approved the plan. Construction started up again on December 14, 1944, and in 2006, the dam began generating power. Currently, it's operating at full capacity. But even if Taiwan did choose to retaliate by blowing up the world's 4th largest dam, a course of action that's been hotly debated in Taiwan since the early 1990s, the question still remains: does the Taiwanese military even have the necessary capabilities to do so? Back in 2018, a strategist with Taiwan's renowned Tamkang University suggested that 2 well-placed ballistic missiles would probably do the job, but the Chinese media was quick to dismiss this as false. The dam, they said, is a steel-concrete gravity dam, meaning that the water is contained by the sheer mass of the individual sections. So even if one section was seriously damaged, that doesn't mean the others would be compromised. Due to its immense size, they claimed, it could potentially withstand the impact of a tactical nuclear strike. The state media also pointed out the air defense capabilities of the People's Liberation Army, consisting of large numbers of anti-air and anti-surface missiles, along with its regional missile defense shield, would be more than enough to ward off any attack. More recently, though, during an unusual exchange between a Taiwanese legislator and an official from China's Taiwan Affairs Office, the issue was raised again. The representative from Taiwan said they'd never invade China, nor would they launch an unprovoked attack on Beijing or the Three Gorges Dam. But before China attacks Taiwan, he added, it should keep in mind that Taiwan does possess missiles that can reach as far as Beijing. Unfazed, if not insulted, by the notion, the Chinese official responded, if they dare strike a stone with an egg, it will only accelerate their demise. In the past, even through decades of tension between Taipei and Beijing, Taiwan's politicians have only mentioned the island's capacity to inflict large numbers of civilian casualties by striking the Chinese mainland with reluctance. Well, it appears that times have changed. The Three Gorges Dam sits approximately 1,200 kilometers from Taiwan, making it a challenging target for most of its current conventional systems. A bombing run would almost certainly be met by heavy surface-to-air resistance. The Air Force would simply lose too many aircraft to make the strike effective, which makes a missile attack on the dam the only realistic option. Still, though, China could reduce the devastation of an attack by draining the dam in advance. Preemptive action like this would, however, act as a clear warning to Taipei that Beijing was planning something big. It would also heavily disrupt commerce along the lower Yangtze River. Also, if Taiwan does come out and blatantly threaten the Three Gorges Dam, whether they actually plan to attack it or not, it would likely outrage the Chinese public and encourage them to call for equally destructive measures, given that attacks on civilian water infrastructure are typically considered to be war crimes. The most recent example being Russia's heinous attack on the Kakhovka Dam in Ukraine that caused heavy flooding and killed approximately 250 people. Clearly, in the rare event Taiwan is forced into using some sort of doomsday strategy, the outcome will be bad all round. Which is partly why, in 2023, Taiwan increased its total defense spending. Perhaps recognizing the need to explore other avenues of military deterrence, it allocated a record $19 billion, that's 2.6% of its total GDP. But still, some analysts believe that the island needs to be investing much more in its military. To her credit, former President Tsai Ing-wen reversed years of stagnant military spending, nearly doubling Taiwan's defense budget over the course of her 4-year term. During her tenure, she made the very difficult and controversial decision to extend the length of compulsory military service for men, starting January 2024, from 4 months back up to 1 year. Currently, Taiwan's combined armed forces consist of approximately 215,000 active duty personnel, compared to the more than 2 million troops that makes up the armed forces of the People's Republic of China. Determined to strengthen Taiwan's military capabilities, former President Tsai also put money toward the development of asymmetric weapons, such as missiles and mines, and initiated an overhaul of Taiwan's reserve forces. There's really no question about it. When Tsai vacated the office in early 2024, she left behind a much stronger military than the one she'd inherited. Which is great, because if a hot war does ever break out with China, whose official defense budget is around $224 billion, nearly 12 times the size of Taiwan's, Taiwan is going to need every advantage it can get if it will have any hope of holding the line cutting through the Taiwan Strait. The nearly $250 billion China allocates for defense has allowed it to amass an array of deadly warfighting weapons, ballistic missiles, submarines, and modern air defense units, as well as advanced fighters and long-range bombers stationed on China's east coast and reclaimed land in the South China Sea, well within range of Taiwan. Because of its huge investment and commitment to modernization, the Chinese military, at least on paper, clearly dominates Taiwan's. China has more than 1,900 fighter aircraft to Taiwan's 300, 71 submarines to Taiwan's 2, 45 frigates to Taiwan's 22, and 36 destroyers to Taiwan's 4. In its arsenal, the PLA also has battle-ready nuclear-powered submarines and fifth-generation fighter jets, as well as other cutting-edge capabilities that Taiwan's military simply does not. In fact, in terms of the total number of ships, China currently has the largest navy in the world. Taiwan will likely never be able to match China's military spending dollar for dollar, so it'd be wise to invest as much as they can on deterrence. This means procuring more anti-tank and anti-aircraft missiles, investing in rapid mining capabilities, developing drones and unmanned underwater vehicles, expanding defense capabilities, and shoring up critical infrastructure. And perhaps most importantly, expanding and modernizing its arsenal of ballistic missiles. Since it was first developed in the early 2000s, the Seung-Feng 2E, a surface-to-surface land attack cruise missile developed by Taiwan's National Chung-Sang Institute of Science and Technology, has been the showpiece of Taiwan's arsenal. Capable of launching from surface ships, submarines, and ground-based launchers, this upgraded version of the Seung-Feng 2 missile featured improvements to both accuracy and range. But still, the HF-2E, which was developed to serve a similar function as the US Navy's Tomahawk cruise missile, only has a maximum range of around 1,200 kilometers, roughly 200 kilometers short of the Three Gorges Dam. Then came the Yunfeng, a surface-to-surface supersonic cruise missile that Taiwan was initially developing in secret, given that it's one of the few Taiwanese strategic assets designed to reach targets deep in northern and central China. To avoid public scrutiny, test flights for the Yunfeng are rumored to have been concealed within the Seung-Feng 3 test program, Taiwan's first supersonic anti-ship cruise missile. The standard Yunfeng is believed to have a range of 1,200 kilometers, but an advanced version that's also in development could reach out to as far as 2,000 kilometers. The missile's ramjet engine allows it to travel at supersonic speeds, making it capable of delivering satellites to low Earth orbit or, if traveling at Mach 3, reaching the Three Gorges Dam in about 20 minutes. But before we go too much further down the road that will almost certainly lead to all-out war, it's important to look quickly at how we got here. Back in the mid-20th century, the Communist People's Republic of China, the PRC, and the Old Republic of China, the ROC, ended up fighting a brutal civil war for control of mainland China that lasted until 1949. The war ended when the PRC forced the ROC to retreat to the island nation of Taiwan, which had been annexed China by the Qing dynasty in 1683. Despite strong grassroots support, a superior military, and large arsenal of Japanese weapons assembled from stocks left in Manchuria after Japan's occupation ended in 1945, at the end of the Civil War, the Communists didn't hold any major cities. But years of corruption and mismanagement had eroded public support for the ROC, who as early as 1947 had been looking to Taiwan as a possible point of relocation. And when the ROC did ultimately head for Taiwan, this effectively ended the fighting, but a formal peace treaty to officially end the conflict was never signed, which means technically the Chinese Civil War has been more or less on pause for the past 3/4 of a century, making it one of the modern world's longest-lasting frozen conflicts. And all this time, ever since the ROC was expelled from mainland China, the PRC has claimed to be the sole legitimate government of all of China, of which Taiwan is an inseparable part. This stance is commonly referred to as the One China policy, and in practical terms means that Beijing does not and will not recognize Taiwan as an independent country, but rather a province in rebellion. But this is where things get a little tricky, given that the ROC also officially supports the One China policy, just in reverse. It's like this: the ROC does not deny that Taiwan is a part of China, the only difference is they're claiming that they are the legitimate government, and not the PRC, meaning the Taiwanese government effectively views all of mainland China as a series of its provinces that have been in constant rebellion for the past 75 years. However, the ROC's adherence to the One China policy should be considered primarily as a strategic political maneuver, more theatrical than practical. For in a way, they are compelled to maintain their position as the sole government of all of China, however implausible, because if the ROC were to abandon this claim and simply say, "We are only the government of Taiwan," Beijing could interpret this as a formal declaration of independence, which would likely prompt an immediate military response. But if China feels so strongly about reunification, you might be asking, why has it waited so long to even attempt to take back Taiwan? Well, back in 1972, Chairman Mao Zedong famously told US President Richard Nixon that the PRC could wait 100 years for Taiwan to come back. So for many decades, that's what Beijing did. It waited, hoping that Taiwan would voluntarily decide to reunify with the mainland. But now, half a century later, Taiwan has shown less and less interest in teaming back up. It appears that Beijing has run out of patience. And this has prompted both Taiwan and the United States to prepare themselves for a potential conflict, a conflict that neither side truly wants and no nation would benefit from. For if a war between China and a US-backed Taiwan were to break out, it would profoundly disrupt the world as we know it, causing irreversible damage to the global economy and compromise an untold number of vital international relationships. This is why everyone, especially Taiwan, has been looking for ways to deter China, the most likely candidate to throw the first stone. For their part, Taiwan has adopted 3 overlapping strategies of deterrence. The more diplomatic of the three, as we discussed before, requires Taipei, at an official level, to stay committed to the One China policy and keep insisting that the ROC is the rightful government of all of China. It's a bit far-fetched, but by sticking with this approach, it leaves China with some hope, a very small amount of hope, that the ROC might one day reverse course and peacefully concede control of Taiwan to Beijing. This, however, is highly unlikely, as over the years Taiwan has developed into an enthusiastic democracy with a political culture that starkly contrasts China's current autocratic system. While it doesn't exactly fit the traditional model of a dictatorship, where power is concentrated in the hands of a single individual, the PRC maintains tight control over the government, military, media, and civil society, which has made the Taiwanese even more determined not to reunify. At the moment, the two largest political parties on the island are the old Kuomintang Party, or KMT, which continues to push for Chinese nationalism and peaceful reunification with the mainland, and the Democratic Progressive Party, or DPP, which remains a staunch advocate for Taiwanese nationalism and eventual statehood. The last three presidential elections in Taiwan in 2016, 2020, and 2024 have all resulted in DPP victories, essentially crushing Beijing's dream of a diplomatic reunification and the world's hope for a peaceful resolution. For as long as the DPP has been in power, any step Taiwan has taken toward international recognition as a separate state, Beijing has met with increasing hostility. Take, for example, Nancy Pelosi's visit to the island in August of 2022. Her visit wasn't officially sanctioned by the White House, but at the time she was serving as the Speaker of the US House of Representatives, and during a press conference with President Tsai, said that her visit was a sign of the United States' unwavering commitment to supporting Taiwan's democracy. This, unsurprisingly, infuriated Beijing. And within days of Pelosi's departure from the island, Chinese fighter jets tore across the so-called median line running down the middle of the Taiwan Strait. The Chinese Navy patrolled heavily around Taiwan's eastern coast, and a barrage of Chinese ballistic missiles splashed down all around the island, while some even flew directly overhead and crashed into the exclusive economic zone of Japan. These events, which were unprecedented until then, came as a rude awakening for US military planners who'd long thought a full-scale Chinese invasion of Taiwan was impossible. And now, with 4 years of DPP rule ahead, under newly elected President Lai Ching-te, it's hard to say what China might do if intentionally or unintentionally provoked. Given that there's little to no hope of diplomatic reunification, does that leave war as the only option? Hopefully, President Xi Jinping thinks long and hard before crossing that line, because even if the US doesn't officially acknowledge Taiwan's independence and hasn't since 1979, it does have strong unofficial relationships with the island and remains its most fruitful backer and arms supplier. Past comments made by President Joe Biden have also suggested that the US would defend Taiwan if it were attacked. Biden is also planning to dispatch an unofficial delegation to Taipei as a demonstration of its continued support for the DPP and its new president. But still, this doesn't guarantee that the US will intervene on Taiwan's behalf. In 1991, the US jumped to defend Kuwait when Saddam Hussein invaded, but Kuwait had something Taiwan doesn't: oil. A lot of oil. And Washington simply couldn't risk that supply falling into Saddam's hands. Taiwan, on the other hand, lacks significant natural resources that might encourage the US or others to come to its aid. The island possesses virtually no oil, coal, or gas. However, what Taiwan lacks in natural resources, it more than makes up for in technological ingenuity, business savvy, and forward thinking. And this brings us to the second of Taiwan's overlapping deterrence strategies, or what's commonly referred to as its Silicon Shield. After being invented and developed in the US in the late 1950s and early 60s, silicon microchips only got smaller and more advanced as time went on. Now they are one of the world's most important technological resources, used in computers, smartphones, digital cameras, drones, microwaves, calculators, and air conditioners. They are also essential to cryptocurrency mining and the stock market. Oh, not to mention guided missiles, fighter jets, and a whole range of other military applications related to artificial intelligence. Initially, US companies dominated every aspect of microchip production, from research and development to design, to the invention of the highly specialized tools required for assembly, to the manufacturing process itself. But by the late 1980s, American companies were becoming increasingly frustrated with the ever higher costs of actually building the chips. Coincidentally, it was around this time too that Morris Chang, the undisputed godfather of the microchip industry, returned to Taiwan and, along with the ROC government, came up with an idea. Instead of competing with the US by developing a separate microchip industry and risk antagonizing the US government, why not create a new type of company that focuses solely on the expensive and labor-intensive manufacturing process? For the biggest US microchip companies like Texas Instruments, where Chang had been working the past 25 years, outsourcing this final stage of the process would both lower their overall costs and increase their profit margins. It would also, Chang and the ROC suspected, solidify Taiwan's status as crucial to the still emerging microchip industry. Today, the most advanced microchips, designed by companies like Apple, can only be manufactured within a single building in Taiwan's Hsinchu Science Park, located about 80 kilometers southwest of Taipei. And the company who manufactures them, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company Limited, or simply TSMC, is one of the largest and most valuable companies in the world. 4 of the 9 largest global microchip manufacturers are located in Taiwan, and together they produce nearly 70% of the world's microchips. More importantly though, these 4 companies produce around 90% of the world's most cutting-edge chips that contain billions of microscopic transistors, some that are 5 nanometers or smaller, about the width of a strand of human DNA. And it's the protection of this industry that makes Taiwan's continued security absolutely vital to just about every country in the world. And how vital? Well, in a study commissioned by the US Department of Defense, researchers determined that any serious disruption of Taiwan's microchip industry would result in an estimated $2.5 trillion in losses per year to the worldwide economy. That's more than the economies of Ukraine and Russia combined. Were this industry to be seriously compromised, it would likely trigger a worldwide financial meltdown. Global production of smartphones would be cut in half at least, while the manufacture of just about everything, computers, cars, missiles, etc., would slow to a crawl. Many of the biggest US companies from Apple to General Motors would struggle to produce anything at all. If China were to cut off the world's primary supply of microchips, either intentionally or inadvertently, there's no telling what downstream effect this would have on the untold number of companies, governments, and individuals that rely on them. The ripple effects of this would also reach militaries across the globe that depend on microchips for, among a whole range of other things, missile guidance systems and emerging artificial intelligence capabilities. So yeah, Taiwan is important to not just the US, but the rest of the world as well, including China. And it's this critical level of economic importance, provided by Taiwan's massive microchip industry, that not only creates an incentive for the US to ensure the island's safety, but will also hopefully deter China from doing anything that might disrupt an industry that it relies on as much as anyone else. China, despite having invested billions of dollars into developing their own microchip industry, still can't compete with Taiwan, which means that even if China were somehow able to seize the island without damaging its chip foundries, there's no guarantee that they will be able to run them. Taiwan's microchip industry relies on a complex supply chain that includes tens of thousands of experienced workers, as well as designs and equipment that come from the US, Japan, and the Netherlands. And in the event of an invasion, it's likely that these supply chains would be immediately cut off, leaving China to figure out how to restart operations on their own, which would likely be a daunting, if not impossible task. Therefore, economically speaking, it would be a huge mistake for China to invade Taiwan, at least until it becomes more self-sufficient when it comes to manufacturing these highly complex chips, making Taiwan's silicon shield perhaps its best defense. But are these economic and diplomatic incentives enough to hold off a Chinese invasion? What if Taiwan were to formally declare independence? And what happens if the US continues to elevate its own chip manufacturing capabilities? Could this undermine Washington's economic incentive to defend Taiwan? It's hard to say. But it's because of lingering questions like these that Taiwan has had to come up with a third deterrence option, the one we've already discussed, the hypothetical destruction of the Three Gorges Dam. Hypothetically, if Taiwan was able to stockpile enough supersonic ballistic missiles to bring down the dam, which could be thousands, given that the dam is essentially a mountain of concrete, this would result in one of the largest and most horrific floods in human history. The lower Yangtze Valley would be completely submerged under an apocalyptic amount of water. The cities of Wuhan, Nanjing, and Shanghai would be mostly washed away. And as we said before, along with catastrophic economic damage, millions, if not tens of millions, of civilians would likely be killed. But an attack on the dam might not even be necessary to trigger this disaster. Way back in 2008, Chinese officials acknowledged that the Three Gorges Reservoir might be triggering landslides, altering the local ecosystem, and causing a whole range of other serious environmental problems. For years leading up to the dam's construction, geologists, biologists, and environmentalists warned that building such a massive hydropower dam in such a heavily populated area would threaten millions of lives, as well as an untold number of plant and animal species. These warnings came long before the government ordered some 1.2 million people that had been living in towns and villages along the banks of the Yangtze River to leave. And even after, Chinese and foreign scientists warned that the area's remaining residents would be in danger, and they were right. Only a month after the reservoir began being filled, in June 2003, around 20 million cubic meters of rock slid into the Qingjiang River, just 3 kilometers from where it flows into the Yangtze, creating 20-meter-high waves that killed at least 14 people. But still the water levels were raised, and in November 2007, the ground gave out again, and over 3,000 cubic meters of earth and rock tumbled onto a highway near the entrance to a railway tunnel in Badong County, burying a bus and killing at least 30 people. Tinkering with the reservoir's water level over the years is also believed to have caused a series of localized earthquakes, as the dam was built on a pair of major fault lines, the Jiuangxi and the Zigui Badong. For now though, the dam is still absolutely fundamental to China's industrial, commercial, and residential sectors, as it provides electricity to around 20 million people. This means too that an attack on the dam would almost certainly trigger a retaliatory nuclear strike from Beijing. Which means even in retaliation, Taiwan would probably never utilize this option. So the ROC must simply hope that knowing they could do it will dissuade China from ever attempting an invasion. It's certainly possible too that a more conventional strategy of military deterrence will be enough to make Beijing think twice before sending its troops across the Taiwan Strait. In recent years, Taiwan has transformed itself into a hard target with a formidable defense, leaning heavily on what military planners call the porcupine strategy that was first introduced in 2017 by the former chief of Taiwanese military, Lee Si-ming, but has evolved via a range of lessons learned in Ukraine. This strategy is based on the effectiveness of asymmetrical warfare, mines, mobile missile systems, and drones to impede and demoralize an invading force. While the porcupine analogy stems from the animal's natural defensive capabilities, its thousands of individual barbed quills sticking out in every direction, in a military sense, this is what the mountainous islands of Taiwan look like now, except its quills are primarily mobile anti-aircraft, anti-tank, and anti-ship weapons. Taiwan's military leaders are also well aware that a Chinese invasion would be the largest amphibious invasion since 1944, when the Allies landed in Normandy on D-Day. To be successful, China would need to assemble between 300,000 to as many as 1 million troops, plus equipment, and it would take an armada of hundreds of transport ships concentrated on the western side of the Taiwan Strait to deploy them. And there's just no way China could assemble such a massive force without drawing the attention of US surveillance satellites. Washington would undoubtedly pass this information on to the Taiwanese military, giving them time to ramp up their countermeasures and strengthen their defenses even more. Just as the US warned Ukraine of imminent Russian aggression, for months leading up to the actual invasion, American intelligence agencies would almost certainly do the same for Taiwan. This scenario, however, would be far more challenging than Russia's attack on Ukraine. Before invading, Russia was able to amass a huge number of troops, as well as tanks, artillery, fuel, and ammunition, along thousands of kilometers of Ukraine's borders. Taiwan, on the other hand, is separated from the Chinese mainland by the Taiwan Strait, about 130 kilometers of open ocean. En route, China's fleet would be highly vulnerable to Taiwanese missiles and aerial assaults. Getting across the strait, though, through waters that are typically rough most of the year, would probably be the least of their problems. With mostly rugged terrain and limited beaches, Taiwan's coastline is not ideal at all for a massive amphibious landing. Not to mention, all of the 14 possible beachheads where Chinese troops could land have already been extensively fortified. Any assaulting force could expect to face heavy artillery, missile attacks, and machine gun fire upon arrival. It's also believed that at least some of the beaches are equipped with a series of underwater pipelines designed to pump flammable liquid into the shallows and torch landing troops. Clearly, the sort of invasion that would be necessary to take Taiwan would not be a walk in the park for China. But depending on how desperate Beijing gets, conventional military deterrence might not be enough. Even so, Taiwan still has their diplomatic strategy and silicon shield to fall back on. And if nothing else works and Chinese troops are storming toward Taipei, they will still have one card left to play, the Three Gorges Dam. To actually arrive at this doomsday scenario, though, where mutually assured destruction is the only option left, Taiwan would not only need to be abandoned by its allies, but all of its other potential deterrents would have to have clearly failed. But what do you think? Are economic and diplomatic incentives enough to hold off a Chinese invasion? Will Taiwan's porcupine strategy or silicon shield keep Chinese troops from landing on its shores? What if Taiwan were to formally declare independence? Even in retaliation, would an attack on the Three Gorges Dam be justifiable? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Now go and check out Taiwan's strategy to counter Chinese invasion, or click this other video instead.